Headline edition, July 8, 1947. The Army Air Forces has announced that a flying disc has been found and is now in the possession of the Army.
However, there have been a certain percentage of this volume of reports that have been made by credible observers of relatively incredible things.
3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11. Tower clear.
But other sightings apparently were taken more seriously.
And one in particular, an incident called the Rendlesham Forest Incident, also known as Britain's Roswell. This was in 1980, shortly after Christmas, when a few American airmen who were stationed in the UK reported seeing a UFO.
A huge, solid, diamond-shaped object they described as 100 foot long, hovering silently in the sky above them.
There is very compelling evidence that we may not be alone, whatever that means.
Understands UFOs are real. This is a technology that is so far beyond anything that we have.
Reportedly appear to exhibit unusual flight characteristics, appear to demonstrate advanced technology.
AARO is the culmination of decades of DoD, intelligence community, and congressionally directed efforts to successfully resolve UAP encountered first and foremost by U.S. military.
What is up, everybody? Welcome back to Disclosure Team here on YouTube. It's good to be back for our weekly interview. Before I bring on my guest, guys, as always, please keep the live chat respectful, cool, calm, and collected like you always do. I appreciate that. I'm going to say a quick hello who I can see here already. We've got Lord Bass, Jos, Lara, Kate. Who else we got? Moon, Nathan of the Amazing People podcast. If you don't already, go and subscribe to Nathan's channel. Carolina, always a pleasure. Dave, guys, thank you so much for being here. And if you have any questions throughout, please pop them in capital letters, or Super Chat is available if you wanted to support the show. But I'm really excited for this conversation today. It is a returning guest, a good friend of mine. He is always coming with the knowledge. So let's not waste any more time. Let's bring him right in. And please welcome Victor Viggiani. Victor, how's it going, my friend?
Just fine, thank you. Given the incredible odds, we're doing just fine here.
Good to hear. I like the positivity for sure.
For sure.
Well, listen, Victor, it's been an interesting time. It's been probably quite a few months since we last spoke, and there's a lot to go over. But one place I really wanted to start was in Canada. Because, you know, last year it seemed to be a lot was moving, and, you know, like I just mentioned to you before we came on, it just seems to have died off a little bit. So can you kind of bring us up to date with what's happening?
Well, the reason that it may have sort of quote unquote died off is because Parliament, as you well know in the UK and here in Canada, our parliamentary systems are very similar. There is the summer recess. And from that, I think some of the committee meetings that the MPs who have shown some interest in the UAP issue are sort of on hiatus. The committee meetings are not happening, and the conversations among the parliamentarians are really not occurring as quickly and as frequently as they were. Now we do expect Parliament will reconvene in September, but that's the reason basically that we haven't had a whole lot of information coming back and forth about this stuff. So I'm confident that this is going to, resurrect itself. And I think Larry Maguire, who we'll get into in a few moments, will still be hopefully as interested as he was before, because he was the chairperson or the vice chair of one of the Natural Resources Committee who raised the issue of these sort of UAP or unacknowledged craft or whatever it happened to be over some nuclear facilities here in Canada. I say nuclear facilities they weren't nuclear installations with missiles or anything like that. These are energy producing nuclear facilities here in Canada, with some of these things hovering over them. So he showed a great interest in that, and he raised the issue with the Deputy Minister, John Hannaford, at a committee meeting. And he wove those things very carefully into the questions where, are you aware, first of all, that some of these craft of unknown, whatever it happens to be, whether be they drones or whatever they were, unknowns, let's put it that way, or tracks of interest, as NORAD calls them, were hovering over some of our nuclear facilities. And John Hannaford, the Deputy Minister, had no idea that was happening. And then Maguire pressed him further, and he asked Hannaford, were you aware of what's going on in the United States? And this is long before any of the hearings that we're seeing now. This is last year. Were they aware of what was going on with respect to the national disclosure information that was going on in the States? And Hannaford, admitted complete ignorance. He had no idea about it. Now, whether or not that was feigned ignorance or whether, in fact, he really didn't, I believe he really did not know about this, and so does Maguire. So the point that I'm making is that Maguire was pushing this thing forward within the committee to find out what some of these high-level ministers and within cabinet were aware of what was going on south of the border with respect to all of the information that came out as far back as 2017, which we can get into if you want later on. But I think what Maguire did actually was show that the Canadian Parliament and the cabinet appeared to be, underline the word appeared to be, totally unaware of what was going on in the United States with respect to the UAP issue. And so he moved forward with that and began to do some digging. And from that, I made some communications with Mr. Maguire's office, and one of his parliamentary assistants, Drew Ostash, he and I have had several conversations about what Mr. Maguire was into, why he was doing it. And I think it's basically because Larry is an inquisitive individual. And I think that because he's the chair of this committee, or vice chair of the committee, he just wants to know what's going on with respect to these things, and why the Canadian government really isn't being very transparent about what's going on. So that was something that Larry did. And I believe, and I firmly believe, I'm confident that Larry will continue this when Parliament resumes in September.
Yeah, I think so too. Like again, what we said before, I think he's gone so far down the road that it just makes no sense that he would just wash his hands of it. It seems too important, and it almost feels like he was getting somewhere with it. But do we know who was? There's obviously a close relationship between the US and Canada. So do we know who was getting briefed and for how long? Has it been a few years now?
Well, the previous Minister of Defense, Harjit Sajjan, he was the defense minister, apparently, that was made aware of what was going on in the United States prior to, trying to think of when that might have been. It was probably in 2021, 2022, that he himself had a briefing. Now, it wasn't the same briefing that followed, which we can get into later on, but apparently that Minister of Defense was, in fact, briefed about the UAP issue as an individual minister at the time. Now, whether that came under the auspices of the Five Eyes or just because of a joint agreement between NATO and Canada and the United States, we don't know that. But he definitely was briefed, and he did admit to that on the UAP issue. And as I mentioned earlier, a cabinet shuffle occurred again. And then that's when the new Minister of Defense, Anita Anand, took over. And that's, I think, when Maguire said, let's be a little bit more intrusive about that. So he sent a letter to Anita Anand, the defense minister at the time. Now, I don't know if you want to bring that document up. It might be available. Absolutely. Yeah. I don't want to go over through it. It's a page and a half. But the fact that it happened is really very indicative about. So there's the letter there. So it really shows that Larry was very responsive to, and he was very inquisitive about what was going on. He was demanding answers, and the fact that he wrote this letter to a Minister of Defense demanding questions, with very demanding questions and demanding answers, I think is indicative of his position on this whole thing. So that letter that you all can see right there. If you want to go to my website and read it more more carefully, you go to Zealand Communications and just Google on that Larry Maguire, and that'll come up, and the whole letter's there right there for you, so you can read it intensely. So that was the first indication that Larry really wanted to be very curious about what was going on within the Canadian Defense Department. And I believe he actually mentions the Five Eyes intelligence group of countries within that letter, and asking why and how Canadian officials were actually briefed about the UAP issue, and not only briefed about the UAP issue, Vinny, but also about the idea of crash retrieval. And that is something that is kind of over the top. It's one thing to actually ask a question of Minister of Defense, do you know about UAP and their existence and radar and scrambled jets and all of that? But it's a completely different aspect, completely different feature of this issue, that an MP would actually raise the issue of, have we ever engaged in retrieving UAP or UAP craft? That to me is a very pivotal point about why that letter that you just had up there is so important. And we have information about that, and I've passed it along to Larry. I'm not sure what he's doing with that issue, but I did find maybe a bit of background on this. The 9,500 UFO files at Library and Archives Canada, I found those things back in 2010 and brought them forward, and I went through them, and there's 9,500 files. And I've by no means read all of them, but it's like reading a telephone book. It's just on, and very dry material. But every once in a while, you hit a nugget, you hit a pearl, and you go with it. And one of the documents that I found was, I believe, in 1952. If you want to bring it up, the UFO found.
Yeah, let's have a look. I think it was 968, was it, the Saskatchewan?
Yeah, the Saskatchewan. It's an RCMP. The way they divide up all of the UFO files in the 9,500 files is in different segments. The RCMP, the Department of Defense, the Department of Transport, they all have their sort of niches and collected files. Now, this one here shows that the RCMP did investigate a crash of a UFO in northern Saskatchewan, and I believe the date on that was in November. I don't know exactly when the actual craft did land or did crash, but this memo is dated November 14th, 1968. And this is an authentic memo written by the RCMP. And what your listeners need to know is that the RCMP is called the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. It would be the equivalent of the FBI here in Canada. And also in a sense too, they all kind of play a similar role to the CIA. So it's an all-encompassing organization with respect to policing for each province. Some provinces have a police force that's independent within the province, and other provinces depend on the RCMP to police their province. But overall, within Canada, the RCMP is a major intelligence organization, which is linked to CSIS, the Canadian Security Institution. So these entities collect information from all over the place. And I was lucky enough to find this particular memo indicating that, in fact, there was a UFO found in northern Saskatchewan in 1968, and the remnants of it were sent off to a laboratory in Regina, Saskatchewan. So that is a very, very important document that has never received any kind of overt exposure here within Canada. And I'm still asking for information about first of all, what Larry Maguire might find out about this particular memo. And second of all, what were the results of the investigation and the analysis of the pieces of the craft that were there, which fits in in an ideal sense with what's going on with the July 26th hearings in the United States, with the retrieval issue coming up in the forefront. So Canada has been involved in this for a long time, as far back as 1968.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a fascinating document.
It is. It really is, isn't it? It's amazing that it's, like I said to you earlier, it's everything that's old is new again,
100%, absolutely. I've got a great question here from Kate. She says, does Victor think that Blair, the new defense minister, will deal with the UAP issue?
Great question, Kate. Great to have you on. I know Kate quite well.
Okay.
She's a former librarian. We did a presentation in one of her libraries before several years ago. In any case, Kate, yeah, that's a great question. As you know, the previous Minister of Defense, Anita Anand, was in receipt of the letter by Larry Maguire. And this afternoon, I just sent an email to Drew Ostash, Larry Maguire's parliamentary assistant, and I asked Drew, very, very succinctly. And I asked him, I said, hi, Drew, it's me, it's Victor. We've communicated several times before. Does Larry Maguire have any intention of resending the same letter that he sent to Anita Anand to the new Minister of Defense, Bill Blair? Now, that was sent 2 hours ago, so I have not yet received any kind of response, from Drew in Larry's office, but I'm hoping that I can push him further to find out whether or not Minister Blair will respond to the letter that he sent to Anand to begin with, or if a new letter is going to be issued to him. So it's a really interesting question. I'm going to keep on pushing to find out whether or not Larry is still intent on finding out from the new Minister of Defense what he knows about this issue. And I can guarantee you right now that Bill Blair knows nothing with a capital N and ending in G on this issue. I can guarantee you that. So it will be a real surprise to this fellow that the United States and Canada have been involved in this for well over 50 years. So I'm hoping that I can report on that back to you, Kate, as soon as I possibly can when Drew gets back to me.
Yeah, that's great. And I wonder, just with this shuffle as well happening of all these ministers, could it be that the UFO subject falls into people's laps now that they're in certain positions?
In a new kind of way, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's a good point. If the ministers are shuffled as frequently as I know they are, I'm not sure if John Hannaford, he was the Deputy Minister of Natural Resources, whether he was in fact shuffled. I don't know that. Right. And I don't know if his minister was shuffled. I'm not quite sure about that either. But once these shuffles happen, it's my understanding that all of the ministers, once they get these new portfolios, they have to follow up with their staff on all of the previous information that they've been given. And you can well imagine any minister, it doesn't matter what they are, be it borders, be it national security, be it national defense, be it whatever, health, they all have to kind of regroup and have their staff sit down with them and say, okay, minister, you're new to this portfolio, and we've been around as a staff for the past X number of years, 8 or 10 years, depending on how long the government has lasted. We're going to try to bring you up to speed with all of that stuff. So you can well imagine how a new minister of defense or minister of health or whatever has to be sat down and hit with a barrage of information from the past 4 or 5 years. And my assessment would be is that anything that's really outstandingly important or critical stands out right away. And I think the UAP issue for a new minister like Blair would have to stand out immediately. There are lots of other things going on. There's no doubt about it. With NORAD and what's going on in the Ukraine and, Canada's support of the Ukraine and all of that stuff, that all is within his portfolio. But once he finds out, or once he sees that Canada has been instrumentally involved in the UAP issue, if he's as smart as I think he is, because he was the former chief of police here in Toronto, if he's as sharp as I think he is, he'll pick up on it. He has to. There's no doubt about it. And if he doesn't, it will mean that somebody either has gotten to him or he's not quite as smart as I've given him to begin with. So he has to do something about this. And I know if Larry Maguire wants to continue his initiative, he will in fact bother the Minister Blair again about this whole issue.
Yeah.
So I'm confident that he will. I really am.
I hope so too. Yeah. I mean, we've seen quite a lot of UFO stories appear in the Canadian mainstream media in the last few years. Do you think, I mean, we'll get onto the hearings in a minute, but was there much coverage of the hearings out there?
Yeah. CBC has Canadian Broadcasting Corporation was the counterpart of BBC there in UK. Mm-hmm. Yes. The CBC has in fact covered this issue. I'm not going to say it covered it like a huge blanket, right? But it definitely did acknowledge the hearings. Several of his columnists wrote articles about it, and basically it was just a recounting of what happened in the July 26th hearings, which is kind of typical of how most of the media has covered this issue in the past. They just give the facts. Here's what happened, with very, very little interpretation about it really mean what it means in the long run. And I don't blame them for that, because most of the columnists, Vinny, as you well know, they pick up a piece of information that's happened on the web, and they just write about it factually. They don't give any interpretation, because they're novices that they know nothing about the issue. And in one sense, it's a real shame, because once they're assigned this issue or the idea that they've got to cover it, they have to dig deeply into the issue. And most of them really don't dig as deeply as they should. So as a result, the CBC, in my assessment, did a very cursory assessment of the July 26th hearing, and with a few kind of, curious opinions, I guess, put it that way, about what happened. CTV covered it, and some of the other minor newspapers have covered it. Now, we do have several people at the Toronto Star with whom I'm in touch with, and Post Media, who did cover some of this information with respect to the hearings and with respect to the ICBM issue, with respect to Robert Salas's involvement. So, yes, there has been coverage of it, and in a sense, it might be a little bit more specific than some of the American coverage. It really is, but it's not quite as intense as I would like it. But you can't look a gift horse in the mouth. This is really good coverage, no matter which way you look at it. Depending on how consistent the coverage is, and when I say ongoing, don't deal with it just once. Keep on going with it. That's the only criticism that I would have of any kind of media coverage of this. You want to cover this issue, you assign someone who knows about it, who can dig deeply into it, who can provide the Canadian public with consistent information about what's going on. But that's not something that most media outlets are really willing to do. They're not willing to assign a writer to say, here, go with this, and we want you to cover it on a weekly or bi-weekly basis and keep us up to date. That's just not happening within the media here in Canada, and possibly even within the United States. So that's where I think it's at right now.
Yeah, that's encouraging to a degree.
Yeah, it is.
You also have journalists like Daniel Otis, who has been covering it really well. So that's a real positive as well.
It is. Yeah.
Just before we move on to the hearings, I'd just like to, obviously we got the big David Grush story at the start of June, by Ralph and Leslie Kean. I just wondered what your initial thoughts were when that broke.
Well, when you mean that, which article are you referring
So when the one in the debrief from Ralph Blumenthal and Leslie Kean, just the outing of Grush.
Right. Well, one of the things that really stood out for me is the fact that when Leslie and Ralph put their first effort in the New York Times back in 2017, I've spoken to Ralph Blumenthal, and I interviewed him about this, and they were very excited about the way the New York Times was, can I use the word, eager to cover this information in 2017, and they went forward with what turns out to be the biggest bombshell of all the information that has come forward in 2017. That began this whole thing. I call 2017 the beginning of the New Testament with respect to the UAP issue. Everything that happened before that is the Old Testament, and I think Leslie and Ralph and Helena Cooper began the New Testament, and that's what they did. The New York Times took it up in a very brave, bold, and forthright manner. And that article that they wrote in December of 2017 is the pivotal point around which everything at this point revolves. So if you fast forward everything, and we have to do a very quick fast forward here as to what happened after the 2017 with Luis Elizondo and the Pentagon and Harry Reid and ATIP and all of that. Fast forward through all of that, and to answer your question regarding how it came forward at the debrief, I know for a fact that both Leslie and Ralph approached the New York Times about having a similar kind of publication on this whole issue, and the New York Times backed off. They said, no, we're not going to do it. And I don't exactly know the reasons, But I know for a fact that the New York Times did not want to go the next step in putting out this new information regarding Grush. And Grush's information, maybe it was too dangerous, too incisive, too inside information, too speculative. I don't know. There's no reason for us to really kind of find out why they did not do it. But the fact is, they said no to Ralph and no to Leslie Kean, which to me is a huge. I think it'll go down in history, Vinny, as one of the biggest mistakes the New York Times will have ever made, not to have taken on Leslie and Ralph in this way to publish what they knew was in fact the most inside information about the UAP cover-up that's ever been decided upon to put forward in the media. They made a big mistake in saying no. So I guess I'm not sure exactly how they did it, but I know they went to the debrief, and the debrief covered it. Now, did it get the same kind of coverage? I don't know. It did get coverage, but I don't think it got the same kind of nascent in terms of a credibility that if it was published in the New York Times, that it would have done the same thing back in similar to 2017. So New York Times didn't make a mistake, but it got out, and that's the good thing about it. Yeah. And there's no reason to believe that Ralph and Leslie were on any less thin ice than they were back in 2017. As a matter of fact, I think the ice is even thicker in what they found out from David Grush in terms of his credentials, his background, and the willingness for him to come forward in the way that he did in the July hearings.
It does seem to show that the whistleblower protections, the legislation that passed at the end of last year, seemed to be working to some degree. So, I find that quite a positive.
Yeah, it is. If that kind of assurance that is being given to whistleblowers continues, and with those three witnesses, Graves and Fravor and Grush, if that kind of insulation is still there, if it's still prevalent, it should give an indication to all of the other witnesses that are out there, and there are many of them. I'm told there are up to 40 witnesses ready to come forward. That kind of legislation should protect them. Now, we all know how intrusive the Pentagon and other intelligence agencies can be with respect to the way they can manipulate people's persona, and which they did with Grush. They went after him. They discredited him. They accused him of suffering from post-traumatic stress syndrome and all the other kinds of issues. They did their best to discredit this guy. And any other witness that comes forward, you can be reassured. You can be assured that they're going to go after them in a similar kind of way. But I think that the fact that the Grush came forward and the others came forward under oath, and that you know what that means. I don't have to explain to your listeners what under oath means. If Grush was lying and if Fravor were lying before Congress, and they find out that those lies were in fact lies, they're going to go to jail. So these three guys are not going to come forward and say what they said just because I think this is the case. No, these guys were well informed. They went through the experiences and have all the documentation and exposure to individuals who know what's going on with respect to this issue. So you can be assured that the American Pentagon is waging a campaign, a war against all of these individuals, against the American people, and they're waging war against the Congress, and they're waging war against the witnesses. So if there's nothing that comes out from all this information, be assured that the Pentagon will be a key factor in suppressing this information. And anyone who does come forward can be guaranteed that they're going to be feeling the pressure not to come forward. But as far as I'm concerned, people like Grush and witnesses similar are going to say, to hell with you guys. I'm going to go forward under oath, and I'm going to say what I have to say. And that to me is something that's really kind of problematic with the way the Pentagon is operating. And also the Director of National Intelligence, Avril Haines, is part of this issue too. Her and the Deputy Secretary Hicks they're both in the same boat. They're doing the same thing. They are applying pressure to the Pentagon and to the witnesses not to come forward. They're doing everything that they can to withhold this information. It's sort of they're holding on to the last strings of truth. And this is really, really unfortunate. And I'm hoping that the Congress has the wherewithal to completely revamp their hearing procedures so that they can get forward these other witnesses to come forward and really tell the Pentagon that we know that you're lying to us. We know there's a campaign of discreditation happening. And so let's have people tell their stories and come forward in a hearing setting.
Yeah, because one thing that doesn't seem to be working is the All Domain Anomaly Resolution Office under Dr. Kirkpatrick, because we know that we've had multiple witnesses, give testimony to the Arrow office. A lot of people that have worked at nuclear facilities and ICBM sites, Mario Woods, Bob Salas, and yet I was expecting that we might see someone of that caliber at the hearings. Was that a surprise to you as well, that we didn't?
Well, let me tell you something, Vinny. The fact that Graves came forward, and I understand what his machinations are, and the airline safety and all of that, which is extremely important, and there's no doubt about it. And what David Fravor, the pilot, what he stated about his experiences with the UAP, extremely important, no doubt about it. And then again, what Grush came forward and said. These were three witnesses that gave authentic testimony. Now, in my assessment, that with respect to all of this, if they really wanted to get to the bottom of this, if the congressional committee really wanted to get to the bottom, there is no reason on God's good earth why Robert Salas and Dr. Robert Jacobs weren't in chairs beside those three guys. That is, as far as I'm concerned, a travesty, an absolute travesty of telling the truth, because the ICBM issue, the shutdown issue with respect to Salas and all of the other 6 or 7 launch commanders, all over the Montana and the other states where these silos were shut down. If they weren't brought forward to tell their story that UFOs came over and disarmed American nuclear assets, I don't know a bigger story than that. It's one thing to see UFOs in the sky. Fine. Got it. It's one thing to say, well, yes, I know there's bodies possibly crashed. Yes, I know. But the fact that people who were in silos 60 feet below the ground were witnesses to 10 to 12 to 15 other nuclear missiles being shut down. I don't know of any other national security issue that would bother anybody. Talk about Joe Citizen in the United States or the President of the United States. I don't know any other issue that would irritate or madden or completely, in disbelief among the American public that would have an issue like that not articulated. That issue has to be brought forward. And Robert Salas and Dr. Jacobs and the other launch commanders, they are the ones that have to become key witnesses to all of this, to indicate that these UAP are in fact they're not here to shut down things to destroy them. They're here to send a message. And here's where I'm getting off in my own personal speculation about this. But the fact of the matter is that's what they're doing. If they wanted to destroy these things, Vinny, they could have done it in a heartbeat. But they did it in a way that showed, listen, guys, you better kind of cut back on this nuclear armament issue. And that kind of issue has to be brought forward. And when I see it as a totally different issue with respect to national security, I see them in two different tracks of information. UAP sightings and all of that, that's fine. That's great. I understand all those things. But the fact that these missiles were under the control or shut down by off-world civilizations of one kind or another, that to me is one of the biggest issues that the United States government has to, and they're not even willing to talk about it. And the United States Pentagon, they know about it. And you know why they know about it? Because they authorized Boeing to come in and examine all of the shutdown that happens at Malmstrom. That is the witness testimony of Robert Salas. Boeing came in and examined, and they couldn't find anything wrong with the missiles other than the fact that they were in fact shut down. So this is information that has to be brought forward. And if the Congress does not bring forward people like Dr. Jacobs and Robert Salas and the other launch commanders, it will be a travesty, and the cover-up will continue, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, we're hearing murmurings of potentially more hearings happening in September.
Mm-hmm.
Personally, I think something under the Senate Armed Services Committee or the
Right.
Select Committee on Intelligence. I mean,
Right.
these are the chances we still have now to have people
Mhm.
like
Exactly.
Salas and Jacobs and others appear. So it doesn't seem to be lost just yet. I just hope that they keep on the ball, as it were.
Well, as you mentioned earlier, we talked before we came on that was it Graves and Salas are being invited to Mexico to
Yeah.
testify. Yeah, so that's another interesting piece of information, and I know Robert well enough that he's going to do a great job at it.
Yeah, and I think it's always good when we see other countries
Mhm.
doing their part
Mhm.
as well. You know, we had Brazil a year or so ago, now
Sure.
Mexico.
Yeah.
And
Mhm.
we know that South America's always been quite forthcoming when it comes to the discussion, at least, to a degree, I'd say. So, yeah, that's certainly a positive, and I can't wait to hear some kind of outcome about how it went in Mexico. So, yeah, it was worth mentioning, definitely. Where are we? Are there any old cases that you think that have become more relevant in the last few months due to the nature of the testimonies by Grush, etc.?
What in Canada or just generally?
In general, anything you can
Well,
think of.
I think one of the incidents, and it happened in Canada, the Shag Harbor incident.
Yeah.
I forget what year it was, 67 or 68. And don't quote me on the year. But I've got Don Ledger is one of the people who here in Canada was a researcher on that issue with respect to UFO plunging into the water and moving through the water and having foam kind of develop in the water, and the RCMP coming up and investigating it all. The Shag Harbor incident over several miles, actually several different harbors that this incident happened. That to me is probably one of the most instructive incidents within the Canadian context. Anyways, it really has never really been examined as closely as I think it should be. Now, we do have information that the RCMP were the first official agency on the scene, and whatever they did do in terms of finding out about it really wasn't sufficient in terms of its investigation. But we do have information that there were divers that actually went down into the waters in Shag Harbor and actually saw the foam, and some of them were witness to some sort of a craft that was down there.
Right.
And that incident has yet to be really severely investigated by anyone. I'm really surprised that it's not been given the profile that it should be given here within Canada, because the reason that it has, because I'm not quite sure if I should even say this. Okay, I'm going to say it anyways. I have information that an individual who I know was taken above on a craft, believe it or not. And she was abducted, taken onto a craft, flown over the northeastern United States, taken to Shag Harbor, admitted to being in a craft with an alien being, plunging into the water, going down into the water, Shag Harbor, seeing the craft that was disabled underneath the water. The being that she was with in the craft told her to get out of the ship and move through the water to go and inspect the craft. She said, "What are you talking about?" He said, "This is the being. Go out of that door, walk out," and she did, completely in safety, under the water, went through, saw the craft, and came back into the craft again and took off back out of the water. Her father was one of the divers.
Wow.
From that, she hid this story, found out that I knew about it, communicated with me, told me the story on several occasions, and I have the witness testimony on file on an MP3. From that, her father and her were called to the cottage of Curtis LeMay to be debriefed about this incident. this whole incident. And they were told never to speak about it again. And she's still under that threat to this day. Now, I've never revealed this before because it is far too, I don't know a word to describe, dramatic.
Yeah.
And there is no reason. I've interviewed this lady before. She's become a very close friend, and she's a nurse. She's a professional, totally intact intellectually. There is absolutely no reason for me to believe that she is fabricating this, because she told me the story that she was abducted as she was taken to go through this experience. As wild as that seems, and the number of conversations that I've had with this individual proves to me that this kind of incident here in Canada, anyways, can be accredited by a civilian who went through it. And why would Curtis LeMay call her as a young woman and her father as a diver, a Navy diver, to his cottage to tell her and him to shut up about this issue and never to speak to it again? So I reveal this reluctantly, but I think I need to because of the profile nature of the Shag Harbor incident.
Yeah.
People can believe what they want about it.
Sure.
People can, if they're interested in following up on it, I can provide them with all the information that they want. And this individual, as far as I'm concerned, and I've dealt with, oh my goodness, Vinny, 24 abductees, men and women, over the last 45 years. And I know when someone is being authentic, and she wants absolutely no notoriety about it all. It's not that she wants to keep it hidden, but she doesn't want to wave any flags, but here's what I did, and here's who I am and why I did it, and I want to become famous. She has no agenda at all about this. She just wants to tell her story. And that's how I believe her, and that's how the level of authenticity with respect to when you ask the question, was there any other Canadian incident? Well, there's one for you right there, buddy. Okay.
Appreciate it.
Take that to the bank.
Yeah.
So that's just, I'm very reluctant to talk about it, but I think I need to because everything is coming forward in so many different ways. It's like a carousel. There's just so much information spinning off the carousel. What do you believe? And it's almost like, you're in a card game and the dealer's got 7 decks in front of him and he's dealing you all these different cards and you don't know which card to pick up. So if you're dealt a hand, but there's another hand over here that's better, which one do you choose from? Okay. And that's the conundrum with which we are faced with right now. We just don't know what the heck to believe because there's so much going out. So we have to ingrain our synaptic muscles in our brain to sift out the crap from the reality. And that's what we're faced with here. We have to, as a human family, sift out the crap from authenticity. And it's a very, very difficult job. So that's one of the reasons why I think I'm coming onto the show right now, not to necessarily talk about whether or not, David Grusch is real or not. That's a different question altogether. There are certain things that are going on within this whole issue that no one's talking about. And it's damn well about time that we need to talk about issues like I just described to you with this lady and the experience that you had. These kinds of issues are not going to come forward at a July 26th hearing again. They're not going to come forward. Why? Because they will be suppressed. Okay. And there's lots of other people, lots of other contactees, which is another issue altogether. And who are we believing here? Are we believing intelligence agencies or people who have actually had contact with extraterrestrial beings? Who do we want to believe here? Is everyone who's had contact in one way or another with an extraterrestrial being to be thrown out in the trash can? Do we just disassemble all the information that John Mack put together, that Bud Hopkins put together? Are we just to throw that all out into the trash and believe someone in an intelligence briefing or a hearing that they're telling the truth? They may be well doing that. But the fact of the matter is there are so many people out there who've had direct, underline the word direct, contact with off-world civilizations, then we're just not listening to these people. And it's damn well about time we did. And if we don't do it, these hearings and all the other stuff that's going to come about with respect to what the Pentagon is doing is going to be a bunch of bullshit. Okay? And speaking very frankly here, I'm really becoming impatient with all of this, what we call up here in in Canada, ragging the puck. Do you know what ragging the puck means?
I can figure it out, I think.
You can, we're just, in hockey, what you do when you've got the puck on and you just sort of skate back and you just sort of skate around, you don't do anything with the puck.
Yeah.
You just wait and wait and wait, and then you go forward with it. We're ragging the puck too long and too loud, and there are other people that have to be heard about this issue. And whoever these people are in charge of these hearings, they're not allowing the proper people to come forward to talk about their experiences. And I might add, and he's not unwilling to talk about it, Robert Salas is in fact a contactee. I don't know if people know that. He is in fact a contact. His wife Marilyn will attest to it, and I'm sure that they will not regret that I'm talking about it, because he's openly admitted that. Now, how many other people who are launch commanders are under the same impression? Another question: how many people in Congress, I don't know, representatives, okay, Gillibrand, Rubio, all of them, how many of them have had experiences? How many of the people in Congress have actually had contact experience? No one has asked that question. And if there's 200 or 300 or 400 or 500 people in Congress, and you're telling me that not one of them has had some sort of contact experience, think again.
Yeah.
So we're waiting for that kind of exposure to come forward, not just the David Grushes, and I congratulate him. He's done a great job. But there is so much more to this issue than just the facts of UAP sightings and bodies and all of that stuff. There's so much more to it that's yet to be articulated, and that's what I'm waiting for.
Yeah, no, you raised some amazing points there, multiple. But let's stick with that then, because the focus is really on the government and disclosure, with a capital D. Yet, and they talk about providing evidence to various committees and that, and yet the experiencer, the abductee, is almost anecdotal only. In some cases you have scars and physical things, but how do we bring forward the experiencer more into the conversation without just saying, well, without looking like blind belief?
Yeah,
it's difficult.
That is Vinny. That's I really can't give you a definite answer on that. It's a very serious problem, because it is so far beyond the pale of any human understanding that the marks on bodies and the abductee women who've been impregnated and brought back to the ship and had the fetus removed from them, and then after the third trimester brought back and shown that the fetuses in containers, and then brought back several times after to see them as more mature beings. That is totally beyond the pale. Again, I use that word. Unbelievable. But in the context of how things have evolved since, let's say 1945 and up to now, you can see the evolution that's happened within this whole issue. 1947, let's take that as a benchmark, and with the crash in Roswell. So that fine, the government did what they did. They covered it up, and then 52 had the Washington sightings, and the UAP issue was coming up, or the UFO issue was this, and then it came on, it was that, and it progressed to a point where it was unbelievable to begin with, but then again, people began to take it more seriously, and the whole evolution of everything, right through all the documents that were through the Eisenhower era, him meeting with the extraterrestrial beings, and then Jimmy Carter wanted to find out more with respect to the UFO issue, and he was denied information by the head of the CIA, George W. Bush. He was denied information, and then with Daniel Sheehan asking the Vatican to find out if they could give up their UFO file. The evolution of all this information is documented. We know that has happened, but if you look at the documentation and the evolution of all this information, the whole evolution of this, what is it leading to? What is it leading to? It's leading to, up until 2017, that's what it's led to. Okay. And then after the 2017 revelations in the New York Times, it got even more intense in terms of revelation. So you can see this thing is evolving to a point where UFOs are just a figment of your imagination. Nope, they may be something considered. And then, oh no, they're real. And they're this, and all of a sudden you get people coming forward to the July 26th hearings, and things are evolving to the point of someone coming forward and talking about interdimensional aspects of the UAP issue. So these things may not be moving from point A to point B in time and space. They may be moving interdimensionally. Now, you compare that admission by David Grush and the mention of that before Congress to the 1947 Roswell crash. There's no comparison to what that is now to what that was back in 47. The evolution of the ideology, of the mode of reasoning that you can understand what a UFO is, from a crashed vehicle in Roswell to an interdimensional aspect of how these craft are moving, that is a huge quantum leap in information.
Yeah.
And we have to understand that if this thing is evolving the way it has been since 47, it's going to evolve even more greatly, more expandedly, more in a quantum way beyond what we knew back 50 or 60 years ago. So there is no reason to believe that the contactee issue will not be part of that evolution. And that's where we're going with this. And if the Senate and if Schumer,
Chuck Schumer, yeah.
Chuck Schumer, if his amendments are as real as we think they are, and never before has such an amendment ever been brought forward within the Senate or the U.S. Congress, he's entertaining all possibilities. And that's the reason why I say this is evolving to a point where eventually the contactee issue will have to be part of the narrative. It has to be.
Yeah.
Only in terms of, not because it's real. I don't, that's for people to decide. But the way things are evolving, it has to eventually become part of the narrative. There's no way that it can in the context of what's happened in history. So that's the way I see things evolving over time. And perhaps we're in a stall mode here, in a bit of, okay, let's just talk about bodies. Let's just talk about, crashed vehicles. But there's more to the story than that. And I think that's where we're headed here.
Yeah, I like the way you put that, actually, because that does make sense, that just because we're here now doesn't mean it's going to evolve in the future. So I think that's worth bearing in mind. I appreciate that. Yeah. Victor, what can you tell me about Project Moondust?
Well, the reason that I even mentioned to you earlier is because back in the mid 90s, I was part of a radio program here in Toronto. It was called Strange Days Indeed. It was the host was Errol Bruce Knapp, and Errol Bruce Knapp was, I guess, a pioneer in so many different ways. He had a radio program on CFRB, which CFRB here in Toronto, an AM station, and it had a huge following. It was on one of the major news stations here in Toronto, and it had a huge following. It thousands of listeners, and it was a relatively conservative radio station. It was talk radio. They had different, but Errol was given time from 11 o'clock to 1 every Saturday night to talk about UFOs on UFO updates, or the program was Strange Days Indeed. And at that time, in the mid 90s, we're talking over almost 30 years ago, he and I interviewed literally every, underline the word every, UFO expert, everything from, Hynek to Clifford Stone, John Mack, any luminary that was in the UFO field, we interviewed them. And at one point, we did interview Clifford Stone, and I think it was one of the first couple of interviews that he granted, and he spoke about his assignment within Project Moondust, that he was assigned to go to crash sites and actually investigate what was going on. He wasn't a lead investigator; he was part of the follow-up party that would go to the crash site, investigate the crash, look at the vehicle, test the vehicle for its radioactivity, all these kinds of things, and investigate for bodies. He did all of those things. And if anyone wants to find out, just Google Clifford Stone, YouTube, and you'll hear his testimony.
Yeah.
And he gave his testimony at the 2001 Stephen Greer disclosure project at the Washington National Press Club, which is very instructive. If you want to Google that one, you'll hear this man talk about it. He talks about it in a matter-of-fact way that he did this, and it was something that was a routine thing for him. So Moondust was something that not only happened in the United States, those assignments that he had, but it happened around the world, in Peru and different countries in South America. So, and Leslie Kean, if I'm not mistaken, there is a document that she released, which in fact does a chronology of Project Moondust that she investigated a lot earlier. Once again, everything is this old is new again. Leslie did an entirely a great piece on this whole article with Project Moondust. So I'd encourage people to Google that with respect to her investigations. So it was something that was happened before, and now we find out from David Grush, the same thing happened with him, and he was involved in all that kind of thing. So it's a repetition, and I go back to what I said earlier, Vinny. It's an evolution that not only illuminates what happened in the past, but provides evidence and verification of what's happened in the past. So everything that's happening right now, this is not new information. I think I found out, if I think about it long enough, maybe two or three things that I didn't know about before. Everything else has been illuminated. Hey, old news as far as I'm concerned. Now, I'm not denigrating the fact that other people who don't know about this issue or have been informed, it's all new to them. But to me, there's not a whole lot new that what's going on. It's all just coming forward in a much, much more different way with respect to how the media is handling it, how Congress is handling it. And I think that's one of the key issues. The way Congress might be handling this through Ana Paula Luna and through Tim Burchett, those two people, and even Matt Gaetz too, much as I don't like to talk about that man, but that's okay politically. These guys are going after this stuff, and they're not going to relent. They're not going to give up. So it's a repetition of history, but it's also a consolidation and a verification of what's happened in the past. So it's something that people really need to pay attention to, and also pay attention to the way the Pentagon is pushing back on this. So you've got these competing forces, trying to bring this thing forward, but then you've got this wall of resistance to say, no, there's really nothing to it. And we all know the real answer to that question.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, listen, Victor, we're getting close to the hour mark. So one thing I really wanted to ask you about before we end is the latest with Project Titan, with ISA and the, bringing the UFO subject from San Marino to the United Nations.
Well, the information that I have so far is that San Marino right now is engaged. The San Marino representatives are engaged in conversations with the United Nations to bring forward the whole Project Titan to them, and to have serious discussions about how we can get this Project Titan within the United Nations. That's the big thing. And San Marino is, as some people may or may not know, San Marino is a member of the United Nations. They are a consolidated member of the UN, and we are asking, because of the membership, and we have an individual who's part of that within San Marino, and he's involved with discussions with them to engage Project Titan to set up an office within the United Nations to begin some sort of auspices or investigative body within the UN to investigate the UFO issue. And I'm not really enamored by the fact that, because it's the cart before the horse in some senses for me, to investigate UFOs. The last thing we need right now is more investigation. What I think Project Titan is sort of wedging into its origins is to get the United Nations to recognize that this is an international issue. This issue does not belong to the United States, or does not belong to the UK or any one of the Five Eyes countries. This is an issue that belongs to the entire human family. And if that's the only thing that Project Titan does, is to illuminate the United Nations to the fact that the UAP issue and the ostensible contact with off-world civilizations is an international global issue. If that's the only thing that happens, I think ISER will have done its job to realize that we are not only recognizing that we are part of a global community, but a global community who has been engaged by off-world civilizations. And once that happens, I think the UN could be a very, very valuable conduit through all of the nations, because ICER does represent 30 different nations. We have representatives from 30 different countries who are willing to attest to their admission that we are in fact being engaged by off-world civilizations. So if these countries can fall in line to understand that this is the next move we've got to make in terms of an international narrative about this issue, then I think we can move this thing forward. And one of the things that I do need to mention, I know our time is coming close here.
No, it's fine.
Yeah. What I think we need to do is be extremely careful. And here's my last word. Be extremely careful about the United States national security apparatus of commandeering this issue to make it its own. I need people to understand that very, very clearly. Because if the United States commandeers this issue to make it a threat issue, we are doomed with respect to how diplomatic contact may occur with these off-world civilizations. That's the danger that I see. And that's why I think ICER is an extremely powerful component in bringing this forward to express the idea that we need to construct diplomatic relations with these off-world civilizations in a meaningful, positive way. And the United States is not going in that direction right now.
Oh, well, listen, Victor, I appreciate the update there on ICER. And one thing I will say to everybody watching now, in the future, and everybody listening as well, is please be sure to check out Zealand Communications News Network. I have linked it in the description. Victor is always on the ball with bringing out the latest news stories and everything, and it's always very well presented and written. So please go and check it out. But Victor, it's been an absolutely fascinating conversation. As always, I really do appreciate you taking your time to be with me today. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you for engaging my whatever. It just seems to be important that we talk about this. It really
Absolutely.
does.
I really couldn't agree more. So yeah, thank you so much. And to everybody in the live chat, as always, thank you as well. And we're going to be back next week with Kelly Chase from the UFO Rabbit Hole podcast. And the week after that, we actually have Ralph Blumenthal joining us then. So be sure to follow me on all social media to get all your times and things like that. But for now, guys, take care and we'll see you next week. Goodbye.